All right. Gene, do you hear me now? Jason? Okay, thanks. Okay, you can bug off. You can jump off or whatever. Thanks, man. Appreciate it. Okay. All right. We're going to be starting in just a minute. All right, everyone. If you guys can start to take a seat, and we will get started. And actually, can we modify the lights? So maybe, is there a way to turn off the lights just in front? Yeah, oh, that's perfect. Okay. Thanks everyone for coming tonight. Before we get started, I just wanted to give a shout out to our sponsors. So what we're going to do is I want to thank our sponsors, quick Angular news, and then we're going to dive right into things. So first, for our sponsors, if you want to come up.
Hey guys, I'm Hannah from Whelpley Company. We are providing the beer and cheese pizza, so you are welcome. If you guys don't know who we are, we're a small consulting company here in Boston. We work locally. We can provide market insight if you're kind of interested in seeing what other projects or roles are out there. Don't hesitate to reach out. We're always looking for a chat. Or if you have a beer request, let us know. But very happy to be here, so thank you for having me.
Thanks. Yeah, we really appreciate Longford's sponsorship, doing food and beer every week, every month that we have a meetup. So definitely thanks to them. Also, obviously, Boku for the space. This has been a great space for us for the past 6 months or so that we've been here. So thanks, Boku. And then we also have a sponsor, Wrangle, who does periodic things from time to time. And they are actually going to be sending 2 of their developers here for a set of talks that I'm really looking forward to a little bit later this year. And we're still trying to settle on the date, but probably either in May or June. One of them is a machine learning related talk with Angular. And the other one is still TBD, but 2 like really good talks. So that should be posted within the next 3 weeks or so. We'll finalize on a date for that. As far as Angular news, actually, and still talking about kind of the next couple of meetups. Actually, I forgot to put it on this list, but I'll do it right now. 3/15, so March 15th is our, and I'll add the link later, is the actually front-end panel. So basically, we have a couple great people who are coming from actually different technical backgrounds, different front-end frameworks, to talk about the latest trends in the world of front-end JavaScript development. So we have someone from the Ember core team who's coming, someone from the React world, Vue, obviously Angular, jQuery, other areas where people have expertise, and we're just going to be going through a lot of like the latest and greatest topics that everybody is kind of concerned about these days. So I'm really looking forward to that. We actually did this about 1.5 years ago, and it went over really well. So definitely sign up for that. And then there's a couple conferences coming up. On April 4th, of course, NGConf, NG Cruise, which I've talked about, and then Angular Up. So Angular Up is a conference in Israel that they've actually given our meetup 2 free tickets to anybody who is interested. So I have a link here that if you guys are interested in potentially going to Israel in June, which is a great time of year, and I've had many friends who've gone to this conference, and it's been awesome. So you can go for free. So definitely sign up if you're interested. And by the way, this document, I sort of put a link at the top here. I have a short link for ng-workshop.outline, and you can kind of follow along. So basically, I'm just using this to kind of help as I'm kind of going through the workshop, and you can follow along later. I'll add notes as well as we're going through with anybody who has questions and that type of thing. And we are live streaming. So like right now, I have it on YouTube Live. It'll be recorded for afterwards. And I'll try to cut off the first couple of minutes where I was fumbling around up here for a little bit. But hopefully it'll be mostly good content. We'll see. So any questions before we begin, just in terms of like Angular news or other stuff kind of going on that you guys are interested in? Otherwise we can dive right in. Okay, great. All right, so one thing I should mention is that Lucas Rebolke, who knows Lucas, who have heard of him from different blog posts and whatever else. So he runs a website, One Simple Mind, and really great blog articles going really in depth on different areas of Angular. Like he goes through kind of, bring it up for a second. One Hungry Mind, not One Simple Mind. yeah. So anyways, definitely highly recommend checking out his blogs. So and he gives tons of workshops and that type of thing. So I started talking to him about that I wanted to give a workshop for the Boston community here, and he gave me tons of material, and we talked a lot about it back and forth on how to structure it. And what I ultimately decided was that a lot of the stuff that he has in his workshop materials is great, but I think what we're going to do actually for this one is we're actually going to do something slightly different than maybe you've been seen in some different tutorials and that type of thing. Most of the workshops, if you look at like Egghead or any of that, they start off, probably rightly so, with the Angular CLI. So and I should mention before I even get started, a naming thing. I don't know how many people, this may be a confusing thing if you guys aren't kind of like keeping up with some of the back and forth of conversations or whatever, but there's sort of this push now to drop the the Angular 2, the 2 in Angular, and just call it just Angular, and the 1X version Angular JS. So just if you are Googling around and see that, that's to avoid some confusion. So with Angular, i.e. 2 or more, most workshops that you will go to, basically you leverage the CLI, which totally makes sense. The CLI is awesome. And I sort of have some quick instructions here that if you want to use the CLI, it really takes just like a minute or two to just, you have to have Node installed first, obviously, but npm install the CLI, do ngn new, and then cd, and then ng serve, and you all of a sudden have a new project. But the thing that happens, and actually let me drop this up. Right. Friend. So let's do ng new foo. So it takes a minute or so to install all the stuff. And it's great because you can just cd into it, ng serve, and then all of a sudden the magic drop is there. The problem with doing this is that, what did you do? Like, what did you learn? Like, it is hard, I found, for people new coming into Angular without any background whatsoever in a lot of the stuff that's involved. And there's a lot of like little pieces. It ends up being this sort of black box of stuff. So like, if you look at like all of the files, and actually let me open this up in editor. So oops. So if I open up, anybody know in WebStorm how to increase the font size for the menu? Yeah, that's what I thought too. Because that's big. Well, anyways, the point, I'm not going to stick on this for too long, because the point is just that there's a ton of files there, and you don't really know what's going on. But, I mean, you could theoretically, like if I just do ng serve, I will technically have an app of sorts that I can play around with. So go to localhost 200, and it works, I guess. But that's not what we're going to do today. What I wanted to do is take a step back and to hold off before we get into that realm, and maybe have that as like, we'll do a second session later this year for like getting into like more advanced Angular topics. And I instead wanted to create the single most simple Angular app that I could possibly think about. So to that end, what I created was I have a Git repo here. So github.com/Jeff-Whelpley/Angular-simple if you guys want to follow along or git clone that or whatever. And what you'll see in there is that there's very few files. In fact, there's only two source files, two code source files. There's a server file, which has 26 lines of code, a client file that has 39 lines of code, and then a couple support files. In this workshop, we are basically going to go through every single line of this app, and I'm going to explain what is actually going on. So my hope is for people that are coming in totally new, that you'll actually, a slightly different take than most workshops, that you'll actually get, it won't be a black box. Like that's what my hope from this is, that I don't want you to think of any of this as a black box anymore. I want you to actually understand what's going on. And then even for people who have potentially already been doing Angular projects, hopefully you'll get something out of this by removing some of the magic that apparently goes on. So to that end, I'm gonna get past, so obviously if you wanna work with this along, git clone, repo, you cd in, and then you can npm build and start it, but I'm gonna go over the details of what that actually means. So, okay, let's start with, before we even get into code files, let's actually talk about some of these supporting files. And so one thing is TypeScript. And so how many people here have used TypeScript? Raise your hand. So like half, okay, that's fine. So I'm assuming, has everybody here used JavaScript? Yes, I'm sorry, who has not used JavaScript? Okay, great, perfect. Okay, so obviously most people, I would assume, know that TypeScript's a typed language that compiles to JavaScript, right? So the tsconfig basically gives the instructions of how that occurs. So one of the things I want to do actually is I'm going to add like a new, before I get to like the actual Angular app thing, I want to just show a quick thing for TypeScript itself. And I'm going to just use sample, let's do sample.ts. So, no. Okay. So let's just do a simple console log, hello world. So when you actually, stop this, and simple, sorry. So when you do TSC, basically it uses, like in your tsconfig, some of the configuration values, which I'll go over really quickly, to figure out how it takes the TypeScript in your source file and compiles it to JavaScript. So I have in mind actually outputting to a separate build folder, and so I can go into my sample.js, and you'll see it's exactly the same, right? Because I'm not actually doing anything different. Like, TypeScript is JavaScript. The thing where it ends up being different is if you actually use some types. So if I do instead like, class foo and some property, let's call moo, which is a string, let's say, and then foo equals new foo. And so let's just actually set a watcher in this. So now, if I go to sample, you'll see that it converts the class to an actual function, because at the end of the day, that's what a class is. A class, so to speak, is really a function in JavaScript. So one thing that I'm not sure how many of you actually do this, but it is really informative as you're learning. Like I found it, for the way that I think, to actually look at the transpiled code sometimes. And don't, like, I know there's sometimes like a fear of doing that, but within this workshop, we're gonna do that a little bit. Like look at the transpiled code and see what is the actual JavaScript that's running in the browser, okay? Okay. Yeah, so the other aspect of this is that if you look, like I mentioned, I tried to minimize what's involved in this particular project. So in our package.json, which contains like all the dependencies, you could see this is like, maybe I could skimp out on some of these dependencies a little bit more, but this was like the minimal that I decided for this particular workshop. And basically what's involved here is really the core guts of Angular in order to run an Angular project. Really, I'm just including like one of these, but these are sub-dependencies that you end up including. And then a couple supporting stuff for Angular, like core.js and zone.js are kind of like supporting Angular libraries as well. I'll talk about zone in a little bit. Rx is a library for observables. So who has not used observables at all? Okay, so a couple people. I'll talk a little bit about observables, but you don't have to use all the different features of Rx and observables in your Angular project, but underneath the scenes, Angular is using them at like a lower level. So If you do include RX, you can make sure that you use only what is needed, which sometimes you only need like the actual observable. Sometimes people use all sorts of combinators depending on how they stream together different observables. So we'll get into a little bit of that, but I'm going to keep it pretty simple because RX is kind of its own beast that we should actually have a separate workshop just on that at some point. And then Webpack is also kind of an essential tool. So Webpack is essentially the way in which we're packaging our client-side JavaScript that's going to execute in the browser. So this is something where with the Angular 1 days, you didn't necessarily have to use anything. You could, but you didn't have to use anything like Webpack. So like I actually have this is like Angular 1 example code, right? And I mean, this is like super simple example, but there's no Webpack needed here. I mean, it's just straight JavaScript, and it's in fact right in HTML, and probably most of you understand what's going on here. But for TypeScript and Angular 2 or Angular whatever 2+, they want, in many cases, you're going to be working in many different files, right? And you don't want to be adding script tags for all these different files. And so in most cases, when you are deploying, you're actually going to compile it into one bundle that is that you can use on your client side. So just the example of that, so like let's say that I have my foo here, and actually let's even take this foo and move it to a separate file. So I'm going to create a separate file, foo.ts, and I'm going to move that here and export it, right? So basically, I'm having a file called foo where I export this class, and then here I'm going to import from foo. Okay, so some of this is like ES6 style imports and exports. Who is not familiar with like ES6 style imports, exports, and module, essentially the module system. So good, actually, that's awesome. Most of you guys have seen this before. At this point, it's like pretty mainstream. So so when I import this, it basically has a reference to that other file. So if I was to actually take, sorry. So I'm gonna okay. So what I'm going to do is just from the command line, I'm just using the default Webpack. So like Webpack config files could be crazy complex, and again, that's its own workshop for another day. I'm not going to get into like all the different crazy configurations you can do with Webpack. I'm just going to, without even any config file, all I'm doing is running it, pointing it at this, this sample file as my entry point, and basically I want it to bundle this code. So it's going to look through these dependencies and pull them into one code set that I'm calling sample bundle .js. So so if I open that up, you can see that it adds a whole bunch of other stuff. Some of this is just the Webpack code that's needed to do some of the bundling, but essentially it is including those two files. Like it's including foo right here, and then it's including the sample.ts where it's importing foo. And again, this is like a little bit scary, right? Looking at like the bundle code. But sometimes it's useful while you're like getting used to stuff and seeing what happens. So just in terms of like client-side JavaScript bundling, that makes sense to everybody of what's going on here, walking the dependency tree and kind of pulling it into one bundle file? Yes? One thing that you'll see a lot these days is that, as an aside, is that in the past, I think a lot of people have used either Grunt or Gulp or Broccoli or something like that to do like different build type tasks. But you're starting to see a lot more now where people are just using NPM scripts. Most of the projects I see people building with Angular actually don't use any of those, don't use Gulp or Grunt or any of that. And so just as a matter, if you were looking at a project, somebody else's project or starter, it is sometimes helpful to look at this, scripts here and see what they're doing, because a lot of times that kind of gives you an indication of what's going on. So in this case, I kind of have the instructions of how I'm building this project and then how I'm actually, running it, which we'll go over more in a second. Okay, so let's actually do that. We can build, which basically I'm building to this _build directory, and so all I'm doing is I'm running the TypeScript compiler to basically convert everything that's in TypeScript to JavaScript, and then I'm running Webpack to bundle all the client-side JavaScript into one bundle file, right? And so when I do npm start, which we're going to get into that in a little bit, but I just want to show that we can see the thing that we'll be looking at more, which is, so the Angular 1 code, which is this like quick sample that I put here, and then the thing that we're going to focusing most of our time on is just the Angular 2+ code. So for the Angular code, in most cases, the other thing, that was right. The other thing I was going to mention as far as the bundling goes to be aware of is that, so like you're typically used to like dealing with your own custom code. Like down here is my custom code for Angular 1, but I still have this like external reference to Angular, like the actual Angular library itself. A lot of times when you're building your bundle, you actually want Webpack to crawl your node module dependencies as well, because it can do what's called tree shaking to basically take only, and it depends on the library implementation of how well they implement this, but Angular does make sure that when you pull in your dependencies and you use Webpack in the right way, it will only take the things that you're actually referencing and using. And so it leads to a smaller bundle size. So that's just more of an aside. But let's focus now on the Angular 2 example. So in our example, this is, and before we even get with the Angular 2 example, what we're going to start with is on the actual server side. So in the server side, I would imagine that most people here have used Express, right? And Express is like, this is about as simple as it gets for an implementation, right? I'm not even using any template library or whatever else on the server side. It's just create an Express. I'm setting an assets library just for the ng1 example that's like a static HTML file. But for our ng2 example, this is the server side page that's generated. And all it is, I mean, the title or whatever, but the key is it's just referencing the client side bundle. And that's pretty much it. We do have, this is where our app is going to live, which I'm going to get into a lot more. But you do have a root, you have the reference to the bundle, and that's at a very minimum. This is like, again, minimal app that you need to run in Angular application. Now, I will just mention, but I'm definitely not going to get into in this workshop, is that Angular can be server-side rendered. That's like the thing that I've been working on a lot. That's like my library that I've contributed to the open source community. And when you do that, there's actually, instead of doing just this res.send, there's basically this wrapper class that you can use to basically look at your Angular app and render it on the server side. But I'm not going to go over that in this particular workshop because that's a whole other world of complexity that we'll do at like a future one. So this is client side only we're going to deal with. So the server side, simple, right? Everybody, no questions on this, I would imagine, right? Okay. All right, now this is where we're going to spend most of our time on the client side. Okay. And this is where we're going to literally go line by line. So this one file, 39 lines, basically contains our app. And before I go actually line by line, just so you know what's going on here, is that at a high level, the bundle contains our Angular code, and it runs obviously when the server-side page renders in your browser, and it will attach to this app root, and then it'll render whatever's on the client side within this app root. So let's get into that. Okay. So the first thing you'll find, and maybe I will, if we have time, which I think we should. I think we're running ahead of schedule. I will kind of show, after going over this, like some of the stuff that's generated by the CLI and how it's different. Because some of this, if in your just CLI generated code, you actually won't see. It's kind of hidden from you or whatever. But I want to make sure it wasn't hidden to talk about it. And one of the things is the polyfills. So in general, instead of actually like having to like call library explicitly, sometimes it's really useful, especially when you're trying to deal with something that's supposed to live like on the window itself, like in the browser on the window object, to deal with just like polyfill libraries. And these are the two most common ones. There are other ones that, depending on what you're trying to do in your Angular app, you might need. So the two ones are essentially the reflect libraries and zones. Reflect libraries help with injecting decorators. So I'm going to go over that actually in a minute when we get down to the decorators. But the reflect libraries help with enabling the ability within Angular to inject code based off of what's in the constructor. So I'm going to go over that in a minute. But that's enabled by these polyfills. And then the other thing that's super important for Angular is Zone. Zone is a really interesting library, and it's one of the things that actually, in most cases when you're starting off with like Angular, you might not think about initially, but as you kind of get into it more, there's so much that depends on Zone. So just to kind of explain it really quickly, who's used like, what is it called? CLR, I think it is. There's a node library that basically, there's other libraries out there, like I think it's called CLR, that wraps all async functions. So what Zone is doing and what this actual polyfill is doing is it basically goes through every async function. So what are async functions, right? So like set timeout. Set timeout is a common JavaScript function, right? It's on the window. And there's really only a limited set besides that, like Ajax, like there's Fetch. There's a couple other ones where I think there ends up only being like 6 or 7 or something like that. And what Zone does is it monkey patches it. So it basically overwrites the default implementation and adds the ability to set properties that you can then interact with as later on within your app. So even without, I'm just going to kind of play with it here for a second. So just so you guys get an idea. But it's the type of thing where if you created a zone, you could do, and actually I forget the whole API, but just to give you a sense, if you created a zone with certain properties, and basically later on, even if it's under a whole bunch of different set timeouts and other async functions, you can access those properties. It's mostly used for keeping state for a given user, so they can. And actually, this is one thing I'm just making notes to actually include a good example of this. Now that I'm realizing it would be really good to see this, and I probably can't come up with a good one right on the fly. But the most common use case that I've seen on the server side is if you have like user information and you want to keep track of that user throughout the lifetime of that request. On the client side, it's used to track a lot of data changes and when there is a data change in a particular thing. So it is something beneath the scenes, but you might see it from time to time come up and dive deeper. So I'm gonna make a note to add some good examples so you can kind of understand that a little bit better. Okay, so for some of the basic imports, one thing I didn't mention before, so there's different platforms. So I am using the platform browser, which is the default, or the most common one. It's basically running Angular in a browser, but there's other ones. So there's platform universal, which is used to run it on the server side. There's I think there's one to run it in native script. So there's platform native scripts, a couple other ones for running an Angular app in different contexts. But this is the most common one that you're going to use. So platform browser dynamic is the default that you want to use. And then we get into some of the Angular core stuff, which we'll talk about here. Okay. So everything is components in Angular. So whereas in Angular 1, you could use components, and they actually have the component API that was added in Angular 1.5, I think, or 1.6, which is essentially just a directive, type of directive, right? But now everything's a component. And before I get into components, actually, one thing that I did want to point out here was decorators, because you'll see this all over the place, and I think when people first get into Angular and they see these, they don't really understand, what this is. So I sort of want to demystify what decorators actually are. So let's see. Just gonna okay, let's change this. So these are examples of different decorators. And I bring this up to hopefully take out the scariness factor of what are these weird things that you're not used to seeing. But it's something that is not part of ES6. It is part of TypeScript, and there's a proposal for decorators to be part of, I forget whether it's ES7 or the next one after that. So it could be part of the standard of JavaScript moving forward. But at the end of the day, when you have a decorator, it ends up transpiling to actual JavaScript. And when you have that actual JavaScript, these are examples of things that you can use. You can either have it at the class level, at a method level, or a property level. So what that means is, so if I have a class, let's say, so I'll do class foo again. And let's say I put this decorator, and this is just arbitrary name, so I can name it, let's name it something else other than class decorator. Let's name it zoo. So you can basically, you do the @ symbol for the decorator, and this is applying this decorator, the decorator zoo that I defined here, to this class. And what is that doing? Like basically, it has an input of meta, which is any object or whatever. Let's even set this as something else. So let's do interface zoo meta as name. Okay. So what we can do is, so now, you'll see the TypeScript error comes up because I'm not defining this properly. So let's call it name zoo. Okay. So what this is doing, and you can, if you want to, you can create your own custom decorators, right? To do whatever you want. But what's happening here is this part, is arbitrary. You can set whatever you want as kind of input to your decorator, or you can even have it as nothing or whatever. But it's got to return a function that has an input of target. So the target, this target is actually the class itself, like the function of the class itself. So in this case, for this, where I defined a zoo decorator on top of foo, what's happening when this runs, when this executes, this will be called, and target here is going to be foo. And so what I'm doing here is I'm actually changing the prototype to set whatever I pass in, which ends up being this object, on the prototype. Let me actually make this a little bit simpler, because I just did target meta equals zoo meta. That's actually much more simple. Sorry, of course. So what's going to happen here is after this executes, basically foo.meta will equal name zoo. Does that make sense? Because I'm just setting it on that object. So the reason why decorators are used in most cases is to set metadata on objects so that it can be used later, so that the runtime of the program, and Angular uses this all over the place, because Angular runtime will use that metadata to understand how to run that particular thing. So in this case, like the way I'm defining it, it's like arbitrary, the metadata I'm attaching to this, and it's not really that useful. But if we flip back to the component, this is super useful. So like in the component, there's a whole bunch of stuff that you define in this object here, and the Angular runtime uses that to figure out how to actually render that component. So some of the stuff that I'm going to go over is the selector, number one. So the selector is just like CSS selectors, and it's to figure out where is this component actually executing. So if I actually go back to my server-side page, it's looking for the app root. And you can, I don't know what all the restrictions are. I'm pretty sure it's almost any valid CSS selector you can do. Although obviously you should try to get it so that it actually ends up selecting one item in your template in most cases. But, well, not always, but for the root at least. So this, in this case, is going to find this item in the server-side template that comes up in the browser, and it's going to render based off of that. And then you don't have to use inline. So this is an inline template. You could also do template URL to specify the foo.html and define that as just an external file if you want. But especially for small components, I've always found to use, and especially in this example, to just do inline here. For those that aren't familiar with ES6, the back tick thing allows you to do multi-line comments. And then you can do the same thing with styles. So you can do style URL to actually specify styles URLs to specify an actual location for a CSS file, or you can just do styles. And typically, like when I'm doing stuff, that's what I'll do. And then you define some styles. So like, let's say div or whatever. Actually, this didn't used to happen. So WebStorm has gotten better about like reading what's in these inline templates and everything like that. So that's actually pretty awesome. They do that now. Yeah, pretty cool. One thing to note with the styles that's kind of cool is that Angular has this thing called view encapsulation. So it's essentially mimicking the Shadow DOM. So who's heard of Shadow DOM before? Okay. A couple more people than I thought. Okay. Anyways, there's a new standard in browsers where you can basically define CSS at like an element level, and you don't have to like do. Typically, CSS is global, right? So anything you do by default, you're defining that style, and you're assuming that you have to like do this specific selector, that it's like going down the whole DOM tree potentially. But with Angular, you can actually do view encapsulation. So even though I'm saying div here, and it's just like generic div, when Angular compiles this and actually renders it on the page, it'll actually scope it to just this component. So it won't be every div on the entire, like if I did this normally, like even though I'm defining a CSS in this one file, and normally when it's global, it would affect every single div on the page. But with view encapsulation, it will only affect the divs within this template. So actually, there are no divs in this template, but like if I added a div here, something else, then it would only affect this one thing, and that's it. That make sense? Okay. Okay.
So,
Yeah.
So the decorator, is that any different than like annotations?
Yeah, that's another name for it, I guess.
Yeah.
Annotations. Like I think it used to be called annotations, but they've been.
So,
yeah.
Does it allow you to inject methods into the class, or just properties?
So you can, and to be honest, I played around with some of the early versions of like when I was using this stuff. Like I would do some like fancy stuff where like in here, because you can change the prototype, right? So I could do target.prototype blah equals function, and like basically define a new function here, and like basically or change an existing function, right? You actually, so one thing that I played around with once is this type of thing where you do like var original equals target.prototype blah, which is like some defined function there, and then you like redefine it. Target dot, yeah. Oops. Yeah. Yeah, so like you could do something like this where you're like monkey patching it. I don't suggest doing that. So it is possible, and like, I mean, it's like when I was, this is awesome. You can like do all this fancy stuff. It ends up being super confusing for developers that are looking at this. It's much easier to just keep in your mind that like decorators are only used for metadata and attaching metadata. Once you are like, okay, this decorator might change the behavior of this method, even though that's possible, I found that it confuses people more than that. So that's just my own 2 cents. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yes, yes, you can have multiple decorators. Yeah, so you can have any number of decorators, other ones you define, you know, whatever. It doesn't matter. And we're going to say.
I was just wondering what some of the other properties you add to the selector.
Oh, some of the other stuff within here.
Yes.
So some stuff it's for what is it? Declarations. Yeah. So there's. Did I do the wrong thing? Hold on a second. Okay. There's a bunch of stuff. So yeah, animations. So one thing I'll say with this, without getting, I mean, I don't want to get too bogged down on like. There's a lot of stuff that's more complex with some of these. In sort of the simple way I would frame it is that there's a lot of stuff at the component level that you can define to just say like everything that's within that component in terms of animations, downstream dependencies, like the other subcomponents, other things like that. But almost anything that you define at the component level, you can also define at the module level, which I'm going to go over in a minute, which ends up being a little bit more useful because in most cases, you don't want to like, for example, if you use, let's say, one of the form library components. So like you could define the form library components like just once in your app at like your module level, and you don't have to worry, but then you just use it everywhere. Versus you define it within each component that uses it. The one trade-off is that if you are, depending on how you structure your app and actually now for the most part, you really don't need to at the component level with modules. But it used to be when you compile your app into separate bundles, like because you can define not just one bundle. You can actually do multiple bundles in order to reduce the size and then have them lazy loaded, which I'm not going to get into today, but you could do that. And if you do that, sometimes it's better to get more specific that like just this part of the app only requires these separate things, and you don't want to define them globally. But for the most part, what I found is selector, template styles are the three most common things that you have to work on in most cases. And then, so the other thing I was going to mention is about injectables. So I'm going to deviate from this for just a second and switch back over to sample. Let's delete this. So actually, no, I will stick with this. So do right. That's fine. So one thing is, okay, so we have a property here, right, on our component, title. And obviously the title is being used here, right? So this, as you're probably familiar from Angular 1 syntax, that the curly brackets in order to inject, a property, and any properties set on the component are accessible, and any methods. So if I have get name as a method which returns blah, I could also change this to get name, right? Same thing. I could pull in a separate class too. So or a separate service. So a service is really just another function or external class or whatever that you're bringing in. So it's not a component. It's almost as close to like plain TypeScript/JavaScript that you can get. So let's just define a separate class, a util, that'll contain different utility methods. And let's move getName over to here, right? So let's say we want to use this service, so it's just pure function, whatever, I want to use it in my component. So this is like a shared piece of functionality. So the way that this works is that I want to essentially inject it, in most cases, into this. Well, maybe this is a bad example because you don't necessarily have to inject it. You could, let me do the two different ways. So you could technically do, if this was in a separate file, you would import it, or right here you could technically just do that for a second. I mean, this is like a simple way to do it, where you're exposing util, but let's instead inject it. So, and let's show the difference. So, injecting in Angular 2, most of the time, and there's other ways to do it, but the way most commonly you'll see in examples is through the constructor of the component or the constructor of the service, where the input values are the things being injected. So in this case, I'm going to do util. Let's do this. And I'm going to explain what's going on here. Hold on a second. Oh. Yeah, it has to be, in order for the template to use something, it does have to be public. So properties are public by default. Yeah, so public and private, by the way, it's just a TypeScript thing. Like it actually transpiles to nothing. There's nothing in JavaScript called public or private per se, but it has to be public. So what's happening here is I'm saying that I want to inject util, and this is actually not going to work. I'm going to explain why in a second. But typically you want to inject something based off of the class name into a value, and then public means you expose it as a property. So this is actually the same thing as doing util and then doing this dot util equals util. I'd have to define it here too, I guess. So this is the same thing as this. Does that make sense? Okay. But it will not work because I did not define util as something that is able to be injected. So this is one thing that's important to kind of like understand is that, yeah, you have to like tell Angular that you want to inject these things. So there's a couple of parts to that. One is defining a decorator injectable, and I think it's in core. Yep. Okay. That's one part. And yeah, I mean, actually, I will explain. I was debating whether I should explain what this does. But I think it's good to know. So this actually doesn't do much. In fact, if you looked at the implementation of this, I think it's an empty function, potentially. But this goes back to one thing that I mentioned near the beginning about the, oh yeah, at the top here, this. So one thing that TypeScript wasn't doing by default, unless you have the reflect polyfill, is basically in order for this to work, you have to, in order for this util to inject another util, so if I did constructor, let's do, I'm like really inventive with my names. And let's just define that other. So in order for zoo to be injected into util, Angular has to know what the actual class is that's being injected. And the only way it knows is if when you transpile the code that it has some extra data. So I'm actually gonna, this is one of these examples where I'm actually gonna show the transpiled TypeScript because it's actually a little bit informative here. So I'm gonna go into client.js and let's look for util. Okay. Yeah, so this is the key thing. So this metadata thing is like an extra piece of JavaScript. Like you don't have to know exactly what it does, but there's a reason why I'm mentioning this. And actually, you will end up looking at this more often than you think until they improve some of the logging with certain things. So what's happening here is it's defining what the actual class is that's being injected. In this case, it's zoo, and then in this case it's util, right? But what is that thing? Like that util is different than if I actually go to this sample. If I do export, let's do class zoo. This zoo is different than this zoo, right? Like if I import, it won't work unless I do star from. So sample.zoo is not equal to zoo that's defined here, even though they look the same. Like structurally, they're the same. Like they're basically empty object. They're empty classes. They are actually literally different classes, like in memory. Like when the process gets executed, these are separate things in memory. That makes sense, right? And that's important because these things are used as tokens in the injector. So what I'm doing here is I'm telling the injector to give me the instance of this thing based off of this token. So even though it's basically a dual purpose thing, like, and this is yeah.
936 the token.
Yeah, the token is the class. So when we go to down a little bit further, yep. Actually, let me do this at the class level, or the component level. So one of the things that you can do at the component level is add these providers. So what a provider is something to tell the Angular injector what is, it basically maps a token to an actual thing that's being injected. So this actually, we can play with this a little bit. This is kind of interesting. So the way this works is, in this case, let me simplify this a little bit. Let me get rid of some of the crush that have been. So I'm going to get rid of zoo here. I'm just going to keep util. Yeah, get rid of that. Okay. So we just have util. Oops. Okay. So what's happening here is this is necessary. If I didn't include this, Angular would complain because I'm not actually telling them what the provider is here, or what actually util is to inject. That comes in here where I'm telling it, okay, whenever you see this token, util, create an instance of util. So let me go through the different examples of what that means. So let's actually instead do use value where we actually define our own. Oops. So return blah there, we'll return yo. Yeah. So in this case, what I'm doing, even though it looks like I'm injecting util, I'm really not. Because I'm telling the Angular DI that whenever you see util, instead actually use this value, which I'm just making up something. I'm just making up an object that has get name and it returns yo or whatever. So this is like arbitrary. Like I could come up with whatever I wanted, right? But the thing I really want to do is I actually want to inject util. And I don't want to just use the value of util. I want Angular to instantiate this. I want it to do like new util and use that as a singleton. So that is use class. And this is the default for most most providers. So you can, as a shorthand to this, you can just do util. So if I just put in util by itself, it's the same thing as doing provide util, use class util. Does that make sense? Well, you can call this whatever you want. Like, so I can name it ASDF. Yeah. So this is coming from wherever I set it to this. So here I got to do ASDF because I'm defining it as ASDF here. You see that?
Right. Oh, so the provider is defining what's going to get injected into the structure.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Yeah.
And you said that was a singleton?
Yeah, so when you do use class, it's a singleton. So just like in Node, when you do require and it returns a singleton, like it returns, it caches it, right? And whenever you do require of the same thing on the Node side, like it's always the same thing with whenever you inject something in Angular, it'll always inject the same singleton. Yeah.
Well, there'll be an instance of that class within the scope of this module.
Yeah, but so it
Singleton, what I'm trying to understand is, can I import that within a different component or module, and will that
Yeah.
be the same singleton?
Yeah. Okay. So that's a good question. Good question. Yeah. Okay. So what he's asking is that technically, like whenever this component is instantiated, it's going to return in the injector the same the same singleton, the same instance of util. In order to do it across multiple components, multiple services, the easiest thing to do is to move it up to the thing I was about to get to, which is the module level, which is like the next level up.
Sorry.
And yeah, no, that's fine. So let me just make sure I finish everything here. So singleton, yeah, does this make sense? Okay. Yeah, we might get back to here. I'll loop back after I make sure we cover everything, but that was, I think, for the most part, what I wanted to cover here. Let's change back to title. Oops. Okay. Comment this out for now. Okay. A module is a entity that encompasses a set of components. It used to actually, one of the original versions of Angular didn't have the concept of a module. It actually, at the root, because you do have, in your component, it's a tree. So like, you know, there's always going to be a root. If we go to the server again, so there's always a root. You can have multiple roots, but each Angular application starts at one root and then goes down. You could, if I wanted to have like a second root here or whatever, that would be a separate application that I could find, or I can create a wrapper class, a wrapper element around these two things if I wanted to have them both in the same app or whatever. But the point is that it's a tree structure, right? So like it starts with one root, and then you can have many components under that, and many components under that, and many components under that. So it used to be in one of the original versions of Angular 2 when it was in beta or alpha or whatever, is that it would just be the root component. That's where you started at. What they decided to do was to have something on top of the Angular, the root component called a module. And there was a couple of reasons for this. One of the biggest ones is that they wanted to enable lazy loading so that you can have, it's basically by module boundaries where you can specify this is a part of an application that can be separated into separate bundles and then lazily loaded so that for the initial, and we're not going to go into how to like set up this stuff, but I just want to kind of like put in your mind, and maybe we'll have a second session to show how to like set this part up. But the idea is that if you request a route and you specify for this route that only this one module is needed, then only that like small little bundle is included, and then all the other ones are downloaded in the background for when the person clicks around and goes to other routes. So you define your ng modules based off of where you want your boundaries to be. Usually you use the routes, which we're not going to go over the router. I decided that the routing was a little bit too complex for this initial one, but you would do it based off of the route definitions. Like these set of pages are for this part module, and this other set of pages are this other one. So there's a couple things in the ng module decorator. So the declarations are basically for components. So any components in your app need to go here. So when you're building your Angular app and you're adding new components, you want to add it to the module. I'm going to go over, actually, I'll go over imports. I mentioned providers already that you can specify like different services, like the one I commented out for util or whatever else. Now imports are interesting and definitely a good optimization that they added. Some, I think in the beta, they added this, where basically it allows you to define, like bring in other modules. So before, I think during one of the original ones, this part where you're defining all the declarations, it used to be like huge, like in browser module, there's like, I don't know if it'll let me go to it. It doesn't right now, yeah. But in browser module, there's like tons, there's like dozens of different declarations and providers and everything like that. And originally you had to like define all of those here, which was a pain. The idea with the imports is that you define, and you can do this yourselves in your own code, and when you're using somebody else's code, like Angular Material or Forms or whatever else, they each have their own module, which basically encapsulates a whole bunch of declarations and a whole bunch of providers. So essentially, when you see this, just assume that what that is a whole bunch of the declarations and providers and maybe a couple other things that are sort of just wrapped into one. And most of the time, you don't have to like get into this. Like the browser module one is just the basic stuff, like ng4, for example. So ng4 is like how you do like the equivalent of Angular 1 ng repeat. Like any of that stuff that's like you just expect to be there. This is encapsulated in this like generic browser, or this sort of basic browser module thing.
So when you build your package, you put all those
yeah, so sometimes if you see, like maybe you look at some code, like Forms code, let's say, like you saw like this is a common thing that I've seen people run into, is that they take their initial like Angular CLI version of the app, and they try to use some of like the Forms like directives and components rather, and it doesn't work. And the reason is because there is a separate Forms module that you have to import and add in there that adds all of those directives and components that are for Forms in particular. And they did this specifically because so that you can have the smallest possible bundle size. So it doesn't give you the kitchen sink right off the bat. You have to like explicitly say that you want to add it, and then that'll obviously increase the size of your client-side bundle, but obviously you want to use the functionality. And then the last thing is the Bootstrap. So Bootstrap is basically just saying that on your server-side template, you want to run these components. So down here, when you actually say Bootstrap this module, so this is code, you'll see that like it's just, there's nothing wrapping this code. This is just like when, go back to the server side. So this is reference, right? So all of this, I mean, the JavaScript version of this, all this stuff is in this bundle, right? And so when this bundle executes, this is like the executable line of code that runs. And the main thing it's doing is it's saying to Bootstrap this module, and it'll run these components on whatever is currently in the browser. So what's currently in the browser is this. At the time of Bootstraps is this stuff. So that's why it will, when it does select or uproot, it'll find it. For all the other ones, if I define like another component, like let's do another one here. Let's do a component selector. Let's do zoo template. Yeah. And then I gotta actually. If I want to use like this component in here, let's go through what else happened. So I could put the declarations here, but again, just as a matter of habit, I may always put it at the module level. So let's just put it here, zoo component. And then we have to actually specify zoo. And then it should work. It should, let me try to run it. Sure, something will break, but. Oh, sweet. First shot. So yeah, so you'll see that it replaced this with what I'm putting here, right? So,
Just a quick aside, I noticed you're using WebStorm. When you bought it, did you buy any of those bolt-ons or plugins or anything?
no, not with WebStorm. And what I would say is, if you mostly do front-end code, I really like Visual Studio Code as well. So like, I would suggest that. The main thing where I actually love, they're both great. Especially WebStorm just recently like added a bunch of new stuff for Angular in particular. So they're both kind of neck and neck in my mind. The thing where WebStorm is a lot better is when you're doing node server-side debugging. It has a really good internal debugger that I always find more useful than trying to do like the Chrome, attach the Chrome debugger.
Yeah, so that's trying to find which of the two is best for auto code completion as you're doing.
They're both good. They're pretty neck and neck. Yeah, yeah. Any other questions?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
The decorators, is that like the regular syntax that you use? You just put it above the class name?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then what if you want to apply multiple?
Yeah, so the question is, for decorators, first of all, is it important to, is it normal to just put it right above the class? And yeah, that is a standard. You put it above the class, and then when TypeScript gets compiled, it will apply that decorator to that class. Oh, you can also do, by the way, there's other decorators at the property level or method level. So like if I had, you know, a foo property of a string, you know, I could have another decorator of like, something else, whatever, that gets applied to that. I didn't define that, but like you could do it at the property or method level as well. Which some, there's different reasons why you would want to, but at least possible. And actually, what was the other? There's one other part to that. Yeah, yeah, and you can. So most of the time, they've done a good job of consolidating a lot. They in the original version, like alpha version of Angular, they had all these separate decorators, and you actually had to have 2 or 3 applied to each component. But they've consolidated a lot of the functionality into just one, just to make it simpler for you or whatever. As far as the Angular decorators, most of the time, I'm trying to think whether I do use multiple at the same time. Probably not, but I do have some of my own like custom decorators that I do add where you add multiple ones. So yeah, it works, definitely. Yeah, one after another. So like just custom here. Yeah. Yep.
So,
Oh, you and then you, yes.
so are you gonna cover testing more?
Not in this one, no.
So if I have like a service that reaches out to big Ajax calls and things like that.
Yes,
My testing, then want to have to reach out and be able to stuff that out.
yes,
Can you inject externally into the component different service?
yes, yeah. So there's a couple things for that. So first of all, and I'm glad you actually brought that up, because one of the best things about DI and you know, especially the new DI, which is you have this ability to do tokens based off of classes instead of, in Angular 1 has DI obviously, but it's based off of strings, and it's kind of, especially in light of how this works, it's not nearly as good. But what you can do here is, like, even at the most simple level, there's different ways to do it, but like at the most simple level, if I, so first of all, in order to do HTTP, so make an HTTP call, I actually have to add an HTTP module, which I believe is part of core. I'm just gonna, oh, that's right, it's its own thing. Let me take a shot at, if I remember this correctly. I didn't install the package. I'll do that in a second. But just to show it really quick, what it would look like. So I import the module. So now HTTP is available. And then you know, I'd obviously have to inject it to wherever I want to use it. So let's say in this component. Oops, constructor. Um, let me just install the thing. Okay. Module. And okay. There we go. Okay, so this would obviously make it available, right? So I could use this. Now, let's say for the example, let's do this, where we do something. And actually, this brings up one other thing I wanted to show, so I appreciate you asking this. And let's say we call this .http.post to whatever. What's the parameters here? Forget. Oh. Is it? I forget the HTTP, but the URL, but or the API, but it's something like that. And so you would let's say we had a button, and this is the syntax for events, which I didn't get into a lot of the event handling, like event bubbling. We'll definitely have that for the second round of this. But basically, so when you click on this button, then it'll call this, then you'll do HTTP post. Now, what you're asking is for mocking this, right? And so the way that you do that, the most simple thing is if you do, there's different ways to do this, but just as a example. So I'm creating my own HTTP right here, right? I'm saying whenever you inject HTTP, use my object instead of the normal one. So now this is going to use my thing instead of the other thing. Now, what the recommendation is in most cases, especially for HTTP, that the core team really recommends is that you most of the time don't want to reference HTTP directly. There's a lot of value in creating your own custom wrapper around HTTP, and you always inject that. You're always able to override these things, but there's usually it's useful to whether it's logging or other things, you usually end up wanting to write some custom stuff. Sometimes security, like adding like headers to your HTTP tag. That's actually one thing that we do for. So we add this wrapper around HTTP so that whenever somebody makes an HTTP call, we by default add the JWT token that's in a local storage to the header, something like that. So does that make sense?
Right, but that's good when you're mocking out or initially developing it, but when you want to put this down to your CI.
Yeah. So for that, there's a great set of testing libraries within Angular. They have this thing called testbed, where basically it allows you at a more global scale to change the dependencies. One thing, just really quick to note for that, and one of the reasons why it works is that with the Angular dependency injection providers, it's like last one wins. So there may be in the list of providers in the dependency injector, it might have this token defined like 5 times or whatever, but it's whatever the last one is that wins. So and I don't have a good example now. I'll include testing like the next session. But when you do use the test bed, that's what it does. It basically adds a bunch of providers at the very end of the chain that override those earlier things. And there's
just a simple sort of syntax question. The decorators, they apply to everything that follows in the same context through the other.
No, just that one thing.
Just the one thing.
One thing, yeah. Yep. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, just with the decorators, so is there any chance that they could potentially collide and by overriding each other?
You mean when you have like multiple decorators on a thing? No, because in most cases, what it's doing is, I guess theoretically there's a chance. Okay, no, I'll change that. Yeah, okay, there is. The Angular decorators, their setting all use the same thing, so like they won't override between each other. But theoretically, if you do the same exact thing that the Angular's doing, yeah, you could. Yeah. Yep. Okay. Let me just check my list really quick. We are 7:44. All right, so right near the end. Oh, we're definitely not going over this. But one thing I just wanted to quickly mention, because I mentioned that, okay, so we have this module. One awesome post that one of the Angular core team members wrote just recently was basically how to write your own renderer, which is like, if you want to if you're the type of person who likes to understand how the framework works at a low level, this is like an awesome thing to play with. Because basically what this does is you can, instead of your browser module, you can define your own, not at the module level, sorry, the platform level, I was sorry about. So instead of the browser platform, you can create a different platform that renders your component in a completely different way. So like, I think in his example, he goes over like a console renderer. So that basically you're writing Angular and like it's the same exact Angular, all the same stuff, but just at the very end here, instead of doing this platform browser, it does like a platform console, and when it runs, it just outputs a bunch of stuff to the console, like your components or whatever. This is something that's heavily leveraged by a lot of like, run it in order to run your Angular app in, native mobile, in Electron, a bunch of other platforms now that people are starting to build these different, platform providers for. So that's kind of a cool thing as well that you'll see out there. And I think, let's check my list. Yeah, I have a link at the very bottom for the CLI-based app that Lucas is working on that we'll have for the next workshop. That includes testing, includes different rendering. I don't think it includes server-side. I might add that. A couple other topics. But also, definitely let me know, guys. Like, even after this meeting, send me stuff, things that you think was missed, things that we want to add. And probably like near the middle of this year, like June, July-ish, we'll have another one of these sessions. But for right now, any other questions for this? Again, I know this was like a super simple example, so I hope most people got stuff out of this. I didn't. I wanted to like keep things like pretty basic, but yeah, just let me know. Oh, yes.
Quick question. One of the things I like best about Angular 1 is when the user puts his data in the browser, sit in the browser and change the view based on this. But from what I've read with Angular 2, it seems like there's going to have to be more communication.
More communication with what? Sorry.
More communication with the server, sending data back to the server.
No, I don't think so. So I think the question, let me repeat it, is you were asking about essentially data flow and like how it's managed within Angular 2. And it's true that I did avoid that topic as well, which we'll get into the next workshop, but I will mention it like quickly here because it does get pretty involved. And at a high level, in Angular 1, data flow, it's seemingly simple from like the user standpoint, which you're alluding to, because you like kind of just do your two-way data binding and everything kind of just works. But underneath the scenes, the implementation is a mess. Like if you've ever looked at the code for like how it's implemented, it is like crazy. There's actually one, I love in some of the slides of the presentations I do, I show this one part of the code base that's actually like checked in where they just say like, don't touch this code. It works. We have unit tests to prove it. Don't try to reason it. Like it's like these like 15 lines of code that are just like a crazy mess because it recurses on itself. And basically what's happening is that it has to in order to make two-way data binding work in Angular 1, it has to do, I think, 3 or 4 cycles of dirty checking through like everything to make sure that, one time through, nothing changed. Okay, but maybe if something changed, then it'll change the second time. Like it gets to be crazy. In Angular 1, they solve a lot of that because everything is just like in React, kind of one way in the way that data flows by default. However, they've added sugar on top of the default data flow mechanism in order to mimic somewhat how things work in Angular 1. So the example of that is if I did have the form module, if I added the form module, which I'm not going to install right now per se, but if I did add the form module correctly, then I would have available ng model. So like I could do this where I have input. And it's oops. Okay. So what this is doing, I'd have to. What this is doing is it's essentially setting up the equivalent of two-way data binding that you're used to in Angular 1. So they created this like special syntax that they call banana in a box, which I think is kind of funny, like banana for the box. Anyway, but it's basically saying like, whereas this is like events, like output events, and the brackets are used for input bindings. This is saying to kind of like basically do both, and ng model is something as part of the forms module that basically sets up this back and forth. And so here, basically, if the user enters anything in here, it'll automatically be updated to the foo property, or if like later on here I set like the foo property to like this dot foo equals reset, then it would automatically be reflected in this input. So it is effectively two-way data binding, even though underneath the scenes it's one way. So you don't necessarily, I don't see any downsides, like in terms of like the way that you're thinking things. Like essentially anything you can do in Angular 1, you can do in Angular 2. So, oh yeah, sorry. Yep. Anything else? Oh, yep.
Can you talk a little bit about dirty watching? I'm forgetting the
Dirty checking? Yeah. It's another advanced topic that like I'll mention briefly, but this is like it gets pretty involved. But at a high level, there's one way of in Angular 1 of making sure of checking whether your data has changed, and the way that Angular 1 knows that a particular value has been updated. It has this default dirty checking mechanism. So like when you change a value, actually, it doesn't really work, right? Because all you guys that have done Angular 1 development know that like sometimes you have to do like the scope.apply, right? Yes, you've done scope.apply before, I'm sure. Usually that's stuff like that happens outside the Angular world. And because dirty checking doesn't know what's happening outside the Angular world, you have to do this scope.apply thing, which is a total pain in the rear. So two things with that. One is that zones allow enable you to not have to deal with that, because one of the things that zone does is it kind of blankets everything that's in scope and watches everything, so you know when things change and you don't have to like do the scope.apply. But even with that, that's kind of like the base level. So there's essentially a better version of dirty checking as sort of the default out of the box that comes with Angular 2, which is like much, much faster because of some of the things they built with zones and some of just the other core internals. but there's a lot better that you can do on top of that using either a mutable or observable based data watching. So you can basically change, I believe it's, hold on a second, I forget the, where did I put the, I want to misspeak. Yeah, change detection, that's right. It's a, so you can basically change the strategy of change detection to different things. So basically if you do on push, and there's a couple other variations, but basically you can set it up so that instead of Angular constantly checking to see if the data values have changed, you can specify it so that it only checks when you tell Angular to check it. So by default, it won't update everything when you change data values. It's only when you specify it. And the way where that's extremely useful is when you have something like observables, which is a whole other topic, but the short of it is that with observables, it will wait until the observable next is called. So an observable kind of like is a stream of events, and the publisher of an event will call next, and the subscriber, it subscribes to that event. And whenever something is published through that observable, then the subscriber knows about it. So you can basically hook up your change detection so that only if you have all observables, only when those observables actually fire do you actually change your UI and like change stuff around. And that's much, much more efficient. That's instead of, as you're building your page up, like a huge page, I forget the exact runtime numbers, but Brad Green, the head of the Angular project, has this graph in his last NGConf talk, if you go back on YouTube to that, about how the default change detection, there's this, Angular 1, it goes like this, where as you build elements on the page and you have this huge page, it ends up eventually being really, really slow, because it's checking so many things at the same time constantly. And I'm sure most of you guys have seen this before, right? As you have this huge page and it gets to be really, really slow. And so that's like this. With Angular 2, the default is it's still a line up, but it's it's an order of magnitude better. With on push change detection, where you are explicitly telling Angular when to make changes to the UI, it's O of 1, for O notation, O of 1, it's just flat, because it doesn't matter how many things on your page. You could have 1 million elements on your page. Angular isn't actually doing anything until you tell it to do something. So does that make sense? And I don't have good examples of it right here, but I could definitely include that in the next workshop. Or if you look up just the change detection examples online, I'll add some links to the Word document here for this workshop.
So I was going to recommend routes for the next one.
Yeah, routing will definitely be part. Routing, testing, we'll do change detection stuff. We'll get into some of the more complex parts. Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks everyone for coming, especially in the rain and everything. Really appreciate it. Next month, front end panel, definitely show up to that. All right. We'll see you later. Have a safe trip home.